94% of American households contain at least one translucent yellow bottle of canola or vegetable oil. The camera does not need to move. The evidence is already on your shelf. What if the most normalized object in your kitchen is also the most chemically aggressive substance entering your bloodstream every single day? Before 1909, no industrial seed oil existed in any American kitchen. 1909, industrial seed oil invented lard, tallow, cold-pressed olive oil. These were the only cooking fats on the continent. Every one of them carried legible biological signals. Ancestral cooks evaluated fat quality through 4 precise sensory markers: color depth, smoke threshold, crystallization pattern under cold, and oxidative smell on the fingertip. A rancid fat announced itself. It had biological honesty. Modern canola oil has none of those markers. It has been chemically deodorized at 240 degrees Celsius, bleached and solvent washed with hexane, an industrial hydrocarbon derived from petroleum refining. It does not smell. It does not crystallize. It carries no biological signal because every signal has been industrially erased. Here is the thermodynamic paradox that stops me cold every time I examine this data. Canola oil begins producing measurable aldehyde concentrations at approximately 120 degrees Celsius under standard pan conditions, yet it is routinely used at 175 to 190 degrees Celsius for everyday frying. It is structurally failing at the exact temperature it was designed for. These are not theoretical failures. The oxidation byproducts, malondialdehyde, 4-hydroxynonenal, acrolein, are measurable aldehydes with documented endothelial toxicity. They do not pass through your body neutrally. They accumulate on arterial walls. An engineer does not ask whether a load-bearing material looks adequate. An engineer asks whether it performs under the exact stress it was designed for, or whether it fails catastrophically under that stress. We are applying that same question to your cooking fat. The populations of rural Gascony in southwestern France, who cooked exclusively in slow-rendered duck and goose fat, recorded cardiovascular mortality rates 40% below the European average in the 1980s investigations. Gascony, France. Looking at the geography here, the distances on this map matter. The fat was stable. The arteries held. The mystery here is not conspiratorial. It is purely chemical. A structurally defective lubricant was placed in 94% of American kitchens, marketed as heart healthy, and used daily at temperatures that guarantee its molecular disintegration. Tell me in the comments what cooking fat your grandmother kept on the stovetop. Not in the refrigerator. On the stovetop, in a can or a crock, at room temperature, stable for months. Because what she knew, without a chemistry degree, is what we are about to prove. Under $4, 1 pot, 2 hours of low heat. That is the complete material and time cost of producing a cooking fat with a smoke point above. 370 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 oxidation byproducts, and a 6-month shelf life, without a single molecule of hexane. The full rendering protocol, calibrated for adults over 50, is in the description below. But stay with me, because before you can use the solution, you need to understand precisely how the problem was engineered into your kitchen, and exactly when it was decided that you should never know the difference. The architecture of a fat molecule determines everything. A saturated fatty acid, every carbon bond occupied by hydrogen, presents no exposed double bond to atmospheric oxygen. None. It is chemically inert at the temperatures a pan will ever reach. A polyunsaturated fat, by contrast, carries multiple exposed double bonds along its carbon chain. Each one of those bonds is a thermodynamic fault line, a site where oxygen can attack, fragment the molecule, and initiate a cascade that cannot be stopped once it begins. At 120 degrees Celsius, a temperature routinely reached in a standard skillet within 8 minutes, seed oils begin generating measurable concentrations of malondialdehyde, 4-hydroxynonenal, and acrolein. These are not theoretical compounds. They are documented endothelial toxins. Lard rendered from porcine back fat carries 45% monounsaturated oleic acid, the identical dominant fatty acid in cold-pressed olive oil cultivated on the slopes of Andalusia for 3,000 years. Andalusia. The oxidative cascade in lard does not initiate until above 190 degrees Celsius. That is a 70-degree margin of thermodynamic safety. 70 degrees. That is not a small margin. That is the difference between a fat that survives the heat and one that fragments into vascular toxins before the food is cooked through. The physics here admit no negotiation. Now, consider the extraction process itself. Hexane-based solvent extraction operates at approximately 150 degrees Celsius, hot enough to strip the seed of. Every tocopherol, every native antioxidant compound that would otherwise protect the oil during storage and heat exposure. Then the oil requires chemical deodorization, steam injection at 240 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, trans fat analogs form. They are not declared on the label. Slow rendering, fat held between 93 and 121 degrees Celsius for 2 to 4 hours, never approaches that threshold. The tocopherols remain intact. The oleic acid profile remains intact. The fat arrives in the pan, still carrying its own biochemical defenses. This contrast was not discovered recently. The biochemical documentation of aldehyde formation from heated polyunsaturated oils was formally established in peer-reviewed literature by 1991. 1991. Aldehyde toxicity documented. The data has existed for over 3 decades. The yellow bottles remained on the shelves. 3 decades of suppressed data, not suppressed by censorship, suppressed by economics. The capital infrastructure required to run hexane extraction columns and deodorization towers demanded a permanent, uninterrupted market. A person rendering fat at home with low heat and a single pot represented a broken revenue node. That broken node, that single pot, that single act of thermal patience is the precise point at which the physics and the economics diverge. The fat rendered slowly at home is structurally superior. The fat refined at scale under solvent and superheated steam is structurally degraded. The market rewards the degraded product. The answer to that question has a name, a date, and a documented funding source. And what was built in that window of institutional capture reshaped the fat profile of an entire civilization. That is where this investigation goes next. The name is 1909. 1909, Crisco invented. That is where the institutional capture begins. Not in a laboratory, but in a Cincinnati boardroom facing a waste disposal problem. Cottonseed oil was a toxic byproduct of textile mills across the American South, a substance so chemically aggressive that processors paid to dispose of it. Partial hydrogenation converted that liability into Crisco. The marketing language was precise and deliberate. Lard was framed as slaughterhouse waste. Crisco was framed as pure, clean, modern. Not one clinical study supported that framing. Not one. World War II did the rest. Federal procurement contracts flooded capital into soybean and canola refinery infrastructure across the Midwest, Chicago, Illinois. Hexane columns, deodorization towers, solvent pipelines representing billions in fixed assets that required permanent civilian markets to survive. That infrastructure was anchored across the American Midwest, from Iowa to Illinois, and it never stopped requiring a consumer to justify its existence. In 1948, Procter & Gamble wired to the newly formed American Heart Association. That transfer bought institutional legitimacy for an argument the chemistry had not yet made. Ansel Keys published the 7 countries study in 1970, correlating saturated fat with cardiovascular disease. What he did not publish, data from that contradicted his conclusion. 15 countries omitted. The USDA formalized the paradigm in 1980. 1980 USDA guidelines. Set from that point, every federal nutrition platform institutionalized the vegetable oil model, not by scientific consensus, but by regulatory momentum built on selective data. The lard tradition required no corporate supply chain, no refinery capital, no solvent chemistry. It was not outlawed. It was simply made to feel backward, associated with poverty, with ignorance, with the pre-modern world. The economics answer that question with absolute clarity. The science was arranged afterward. Tell me in the comments what your grandmother kept on her stovetop, a lard tin or a bottle. That answer traces the exact year the narrative reached your household. The populations that never made the switch, pre-industrial Gascon communities in southwestern France, Scandinavian frontier households, carry a different cardiovascular data signature. That signature is the subject of what comes next. That cardiovascular signature begins in the 17th century in the frozen parishes of Scandinavia. 1650, Scandinavian sweet records. Settlements stretched across the Nordic interior, terrain where no oil crop survived a single winter frost. Every calorie of cooking fat had to be extracted from the animal itself. Scandinavian peninsula, communal cauldrons, fueled by low wood fire, never exceeding 210 degrees Fahrenheit, rendered sweet into a shelf-stable fat carrying zero oxidative load. Skeletal analysis from regional parish burial sites shows remarkably low vascular calcification in adults surviving past age 60. 3 populations, 3 continents of thermal logic, 1 convergent solution, 0 industrial infrastructure required. Move southwest to Gascony, looking at the geography here. Where duck and goose confit was not cuisine, it was engineering. Gascony, France. Slow preserved in its own rendered fat at 80 to 90 degrees Celsius for 6 to 8 hours, a thermal window below every oxidative threshold. The Gascon cardiovascular mortality rate sat below the broader European average, despite total fat consumption that would alarm any 1980s cardiologist. Rendered duck fat carries approximately 49% oleic acid, a monounsaturated profile with no exposed double bonds available for oxidative attack at standard cooking temperatures. The fat cannot degrade in the way it needs to degrade to harm you. That is not tradition. That is thermodynamics. USDA agricultural extension records from the 1920s and 1930s document the third case, frontier domestic practice in which a single pig yielded between 8 and 15 pounds of shelf-stable rendered fat at a total material cost of precisely 0 beyond the animal. 3 geographically distinct populations, separated by ocean, latitude, and language, independently arrived at the same thermal protocol. Low heat, extended time, 0 solvents, stable output. These are not romanticized practices preserved by sentiment. They are the documented output of populations that solved a biological engineering problem with no laboratory, no capital equipment, and no supply chain. They used physics. Physics does not expire. The solution was not lost to time. It was displaced by economics, and it cost them nothing to replace it with a product that costs you $12 a liter and damages the arterial wall it claims to protect. What your body absorbs at the next meal is still a mechanical decision. What comes next shows you exactly how to execute that decision for under $4 in your own kitchen in under 3 hours. The biology of what follows that decision is what no one in the supply chain wants you to measure. Here is the exact protocol. 2 pounds of pork back fat, sourced from any ethnic grocery or local butcher between $1.50 and $3 per pound. That is your entire material investment. Step 1 takes 5 minutes, seated or standing. Ask your butcher to grind the fat, or cube it yourself into 1-inch pieces on a stable cutting board. Back fat is soft at room temperature. No force required. Place the pieces cold into a 4-quart Dutch oven. Set your burner to its absolute lowest position. Target 200 degrees Fahrenheit to 225 degrees Fahrenheit, held there by a candy thermometer clipped to the pot rim. For beginners, add 1/4 cup of water. Wet extraction prevents scorching and requires no prior experience. The fat begins liquefying within 30 to 45 minutes. You do not stir. You simply wait. Check the pot every 20 to 30 minutes. When the cracklings turn golden and the liquid runs perfectly clear, extraction is complete. Across the entire process, under 15 minutes of physical engagement. Ladle, do not pour, the hot liquid through a fine mesh strainer into 2 clean glass mason jars. For anyone with limited grip strength, ladling eliminates the need to lift a 4 to 5 pound pot entirely. Allow the jars to cool at room temperature for 30 minutes, then refrigerate. Within 2 hours, the fat solidifies into a smooth white mass. Shelf life: 6 months refrigerated, 12 months frozen. 1920, domestic lard standard. American frontier households operated on this exact protocol. No preservatives, no hexane, no deodorization column. From the domestic kitchens of Gascony in southwestern France to the frontier homesteads of the American. Midwest, every culture that solved this problem solved it identically. Low heat, slow time, clean fat. Gascony, France. 2 pounds of back fat yields 1.5 to 1.75 cups of extracted lard. The precise volume of a standard commercial oil bottle at a total outlay of $3 to $4. Every metric favors the ancestral method. All 4 steps, preparation, low heat extraction, monitoring, straining, can be executed from a chair using a portable induction burner on a kitchen table. This protocol was designed for the body you have now, not the body you had at 30. Tell me in the comments, what does your local butcher charge per pound for back fat? The price variation across this country is remarkable, and it matters for what comes next. The full extended blueprint, covering every material source, every temperature variable, and every joint-safe modification for this protocol, is documented in the description below. But stay with me, because what this fat does inside the arterial wall once the seed oil stops arriving, that data is the part no cardiologist in a hospital system is incentivized to show you. That mason jar of rendered lard sitting on the counter. It is not a cooking ingredient. It is a proof of concept. What that jar demonstrates with physical certainty is this: industrial dependency is not a law of nature. It is an engineered condition, and engineered conditions can be dismantled. The Gascon farmhouses of southwestern, looking at the geography here, were operating on this principle in the 1700s. Gascony, France. Families in that region rendered duck and goose fat, filtered well water through layered limestone and sand, and heated stone-walled rooms using thermal mass geometry, 3 separate domestic systems, all governed by one shared engineering logic. Low energy input, high functional output, zero industrial supply chain. From the Dordogne Valley to the Pyrenean foothills, pre-industrial communities solved water, heat, and nutrition with physics alone. No electrical grid, no chemical refinery, no corporate supply chain required. 3 systems, 3 dependency nodes, all solvable under $20 using documented ancestral engineering. The 100-year blueprint is the architectural extension of what you have already executed. It is not a wellness guide. It is a documented engineering system. Gravity-fed water filtration requiring 0 electricity, passive thermal mass heating calculations calibrated. For existing residential wall structures and joint mobilization sequences derived from the biomechanical load patterns of pre-industrial agricultural workers. 1920, pre-industrial domestic peak. By 1920, Before electrification reached most of rural America, households in the Ohio River Valley were managing water, heat, and food fat as closed-loop domestic systems. The knowledge base was intact. What followed was not progress, it was substitution. The question is not whether these solutions work. The physics has not changed. Tell me in the comments, which domestic system concerns you most? Water, heat, or food? The distribution of answers across this audience will determine which blueprint we document in full next. The full 100-year blueprint, covering gravity filtration, thermal mass calculations, and senior biomechanical sequences, is accessible through the link in the description. But stay with me, because what happens inside the arterial wall in the 90 days after seed oil removal, that biological sequence, is the data the hospital system has no financial incentive to measure. Here is the biochemical sequence that no cardiologist is billing for. In 1991, Esterbauer and colleagues published findings in Free Radical Biology and Medicine that should have restructured dietary guidance. 1991, Esterbauer 4, HNE study. 4-hydroxynonenal, 4-HNE, is the primary aldehyde released when polyunsaturated oils are heated above 120 degrees Celsius. It does not evaporate. It does not neutralize. It enters your bloodstream attached to the food itself. Once circulating, 4-HNE forms covalent bonds with LDL protein structures, permanently altering their shape. The liver's hepatic clearance receptors no longer recognize them. They are rerouted. Macrophages absorb them instead. A foam cell. That is the answer. The foam cell is the first architectural unit of atherosclerotic plaque. Not cholesterol itself. Oxidized cholesterol, manufactured in your own pan, at your own stove, using a bottle that costs $6 at the grocery. Removing the dietary source of 4-HNE does not dissolve existing plaque. I will not tell you otherwise. What it eliminates is the ongoing insult, the daily re-injury that prevents stabilization. The progression stops receiving fuel. Oleic acid, constituting roughly 45% of rendered lard's fatty acid profile, operates through a separate and additive mechanism. Multiple intervention trials confirm it reduces LDL oxidizability, independent of LDL particle count. In the Gascony region of southwestern France, populations consuming duck and goose fat as their primary. Cooking lipid recorded cardiovascular mortality rates consistently below the European average through the 1980s epidemiological surveys. Gascony, France. The caloric equivalence is exact. Rendered lard delivers approximately 120 calories per tablespoon, identical to olive oil. Zero caloric penalty. Zero nutritional compromise. A structurally superior fat at a fraction of the cost. This is not a supplement. It is not a protocol. It is the removal of a confirmed stressor from your biological environment. The same engineering logic as replacing a corroded load-bearing component before the structure fails. Tell me in the comments, how many years have you been cooking with seed oils without anyone explaining this mechanism to you? That number matters more than you know. The lipid biochemistry published between 1991 and 1998 was not hidden in obscure journals. It was peer-reviewed, replicated, and indexed. It simply had no lobby, no supply chain, no quarterly revenue attached to its conclusions. What you placed in that mason jar last week, rendered at 220 degrees Fahrenheit, strained through cheesecloth, cooling white on your counter, contains no 4-HNE, none. The chemistry is that straightforward. The 90-day arterial response to removing oxidized dietary lipids is measurable in circulating oxidized LDL markers. A blood panel most physicians never order, because the result does not require a prescription. It only requires a different fat. The next act reveals why the sovereign kitchen is not a cooking decision at all. It is a biological infrastructure choice that determines which external dependencies still hold authority over your body. And that changes everything. Infrastructure does not ask permission. It either functions or it fails. And every bottle on a modern kitchen shelf represents a dependency node, a point where an external industrial system must remain solvent, honest, and uninterrupted for biological health to hold. A sealed mason jar of lard, produced at low heat from back fat purchased at a local butcher for under $4, carries none of that dependency. It requires no refrigerated freight network, no hexane deodorization tower, no distant manufacturer operating under conditions impossible to audit. One node, eliminated. The domestic engineers who understood this were not operating from laboratories. They worked in pre-industrial kitchens from the Ohio River Valley to the high meadows of Gascony, France, solving the same thermodynamic problem using the same low-energy principle: stable fat, low heat, zero chemical input. By 1980, the USDA dietary guidelines had formally institutionalized the displacement of those practices. 1980, USDA bans ancestral fat. The infrastructure of industrial seed oil processing, hexane columns, deodorization towers, hydrogenation lines, required a permanent, captive consumer market. The domestic fat tradition was not defeated by superior chemistry. It was outspent. What was suppressed was not a recipe. It was a complete biological infrastructure logic, the understanding that fat stability, thermal resistance, and shelf life are functions of molecular geometry, and that molecular geometry can be evaluated in a home kitchen using only a thermometer and time. That knowledge generated of preserved cooking fat from a single 2-pound batch. No refrigeration required beyond a cool pantry shelf at or below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The industrial alternative expires in weeks once opened and exposed to atmospheric oxygen. The knowledge was not lost. It was suppressed by economic systems that required ignorance to sustain. Market capture. Tell me in the comments whether a grandparent in your household kept a lard crock on the kitchen shelf and what they paid for back fat at the local butcher. The archaeology of those solutions is not sentiment. It is structural recovery, applied physics returning authority to the domestic operator. The full blueprint for extending that recovery across water, heat, and biomechanical resilience is documented in the link below. Under $4, one eliminated dependency. That is where infrastructure recovery begins.